He lost his very first 10 fights, every single one of them. People called him shy, non-athletic, just a mechanic's son who genuinely couldn't afford to eat properly. Fast forward 6 years, and he's standing inside Madison Square Garden as an undefeated world champion, teaching martial arts to Steve McQueen and training directly alongside Bruce Lee. But here's what absolutely nobody saw coming. The same kid who lost 10 straight fights would eventually go on to fight Bruce Lee inside the actual Roman Colosseum, build an entire empire teaching celebrities martial arts, star in a television show watched by over 14 million people weekly, and become the subject of billions of internet jokes that ultimately made him more famous than any single movie ever could have. Some people say it was pure determination. Others say it was simply luck. But what if it was genuinely something else entirely? His own brother once predicted he wouldn't live to see the age of 28. He turned out to be right, and Chuck spent the following 50 years making absolutely sure nobody ever forgot that fact. Well, let's start with the story of how he lost his first 10 fights, then never lost again. In 1964, Chuck Norris entered his very first karate tournament. He was 24 years old at the time, having just been discharged from the Air Force, and had opened a small karate school in Torrance, California. He genuinely needed to prove himself. He lost that first tournament, and not by a small margin either. He was dominated, completely outclassed, and sent home defeated. His second tournament ended the exact same way, another loss. His third tournament brought yet another defeat. Alan Steen beat him. Joe Louis beat him. Louis Delgado beat him. Tony Tulliners beat him across 3 straight rounds at the International Karate Championships. Here's exactly what the historical records actually show. From 1964 all the way through early 1968, Chuck Norris lost 10 separate fights, 10 total losses. His own students eventually started asking uncomfortable questions. If you keep losing constantly, why should we even bother training under you? It was a genuinely fair question at the time. But Norris kept showing up anyway, kept competing regardless, and kept losing match after match. Then something finally changed. On the 24th of November in 1968, Norris faced Louis Delgado once again, the very same man who had handed him his 10th and final loss earlier that same year. This time, Norris actually won the fight, capturing the professional middleweight karate championship title in the process. And here's the documented part that genuinely sounds unbelievable. From that exact day forward, Chuck Norris never lost another official fight again, not a single one. He successfully defended his title for 6 consecutive years straight, eventually retiring in 1974 as a fully undefeated champion. His final career record stood at 183 wins, 10 losses, and 2 draws. All 10 of those losses had come during his first 4 years competing. The following 6 years remained completely undefeated. Black Belt magazine officially named him Fighter of the Year back in 1969. He also won karate's prestigious Triple Crown for the most tournament victories recorded within a single year. But here's what genuinely makes this story so hard to believe. Those original 10 losses weren't close, competitive fights at all. They were genuine beatings, the kind of defeats that typically make grown men simply quit entirely. Chuck Norris refused to quit, and the exact man who once lost 10 straight fights eventually became the world champion who never lost a single fight again. That leads us into the story of how he trained with Bruce Lee for 2 full years. Back in 1967 at Madison Square Garden during the All-American Karate Open Championships, Chuck Norris won that particular tournament outright. Bruce Lee happened to give a martial arts demonstration at that same event. After the competition ended, the two men started talking together, discussing martial arts philosophy, fighting techniques, and various training methods. Their conversation reportedly continued all the way until 4 in the morning, and according to multiple witnesses present, it eventually ended with both men sparring together inside a hallway until sunrise finally arrived. That's genuinely how Chuck Norris first met Bruce Lee. For the following 2 years, the two of them trained together regularly in Lee's own backyard, located in Culver City, California, training for 3 full hours at a time, working through pull-ups, sit-ups, sparring sessions, and heavy bag work together. But here's the specific documented moment that genuinely changed the entire history of martial arts. During one of their regular training sessions together, Norris noticed something particular about Lee's fighting style. Bruce Lee genuinely never kicked above the waist during fights, and never specifically targeted an opponent's head at all. Norris eventually asked him directly why that was the case. Lee explained his personal philosophy on the matter, believing a martial artist genuinely shouldn't kick above the waist, since it was simply too risky and left you far too easy to take down afterward. Norris genuinely disagreed with that particular approach, arguing instead that a fighter should always be prepared to strike anywhere on an opponent's body at any given moment, and that if an opponent left their head genuinely exposed during a fight, you absolutely had to take full advantage of that opening. Lee reportedly considered this argument carefully, and within just 6 months afterward, Bruce Lee's now legendary high kicks began appearing in his fighting style. Witnesses including Dan Inosanto and Richard Bustillo have since confirmed this account directly. Chuck Norris genuinely taught Bruce Lee how to kick high, the exact roundhouse kicks, spinning back kicks, and jumping kicks that would eventually make Bruce Lee world famous. Norris personally demonstrated these particular techniques to him. In a 2022 interview, Norris explained that Bruce genuinely held different philosophies at that particular time compared to his own, believing you simply shouldn't kick high at all. Norris told him directly that he'd eventually burn that particular engine out if he kept training constantly without ever properly resting. Lee reportedly trained intensely anyway, genuinely unable to help himself from doing so. Their regular training sessions together eventually ended when Lee relocated to Hong Kong in 1970 to pursue his growing film career there. But 2 years later, Lee actually called Norris directly with an offer. A genuine movie role involving a fight scene set inside the actual Roman Colosseum, facing off directly against Chuck Norris himself. We'll get to that particular story shortly. That leads us into the story of how Steve McQueen genuinely pushed him into acting. Back in 1974, Chuck Norris was teaching karate classes at his own school located in Los Angeles. One of his regular students happened to be Steve McQueen, at that time the single biggest movie star working anywhere in the entire world, widely known as the King of Cool. McQueen had originally sought out Norris personally after watching him compete, genuinely wanting to learn authentic martial arts rather than typical exaggerated Hollywood-style fighting. The two men eventually became genuine friends over time. One particular day after class ended, McQueen told Norris directly that he should genuinely try acting professionally. Norris simply laughed at the suggestion, asking why he would even attempt that, since he'd never taken a single acting class in his entire life and hadn't even participated in a high school play growing up. McQueen didn't laugh back at all in response. He explained that acting genuinely wasn't simply about taking formal lessons, that Norris naturally possessed a genuine presence, and could clearly project something meaningful directly onto the screen. Norris still declined at first, but McQueen reminded him of something important, specifically the positive thinking philosophy Norris himself had actually been teaching him throughout their karate lessons together. The genuine belief that anyone could achieve virtually anything with the correct mindset applied consistently. McQueen pointed out that Norris had personally told him that very same thing, and now simply needed to apply that identical philosophy directly to himself for once. Norris genuinely thought carefully about this suggestion. His own karate schools were struggling financially at that particular time, and he genuinely needed additional income since his wife and children needed real financial stability. So he ultimately agreed to try acting. McQueen personally arranged acting classes for him at MGM Studios, helped him establish important industry connections, and consistently encouraged him through all the early criticism that inevitably followed. In a 1978 interview, Norris explained that Steve hadn't simply helped him start his film career, but had also genuinely encouraged him specifically when he was being harshly criticized during that first difficult round of reviews. McQueen had told him directly not to worry at all about what professional critics thought, explaining that what genuinely mattered most was simply what the actual audience thought of his work instead. That particular piece of advice carried Norris successfully through the following 30 years of his entire career. His first major starring film role came with 1977's Breaker, made on an extremely tiny production budget. Critics genuinely hated the film. Audiences, however, genuinely loved it. Then came 1978's Good Guys Wear Black, shot for just $1 million total, yet ultimately earning over $18 million at the box office, officially launching Norris as the very first successful homegrown American martial arts film star. Steve McQueen passed away in 1980, sadly never getting the chance to witness Norris eventually reach the true peak of his career. But before his death, McQueen had actually found genuine religious faith, becoming a Christian himself, and Norris and McQueen had previously flown together to attend Bruce Lee's memorial service held in San Francisco back in 1973, where both men actually served together as pallbearers at the funeral. 3 genuine martial arts legends, all deeply connected to one another. And it was ultimately Steve McQueen's simple encouragement that day after class, which genuinely turned Chuck Norris into an actor. If McQueen hadn't said anything meaningful to him that particular day, Chuck Norris might have simply remained a karate instructor for his entire life instead. Instead, he became a genuine movie star. That leads us into the story of the illegal fight filmed inside the Roman Colosseum. Back in 1972, in Rome, Italy, Bruce Lee faced a genuine problem. He was filming Way of the Dragon at the time, and the film's climactic fight scene was specifically set inside the Roman Colosseum itself. Lee genuinely wanted to film directly inside the actual historic Colosseum, not some studio recreation or set built elsewhere, but the genuine, authentic location itself. There was just one significant problem with that plan. It was completely illegal to do so. Filming inside the actual Colosseum was strictly prohibited by Italian authorities at the time. Major Hollywood productions like Spartacus and Gladiator had all been forced to recreate the famous landmark elsewhere instead. Nobody legitimately filmed inside the actual historic amphitheater. Bruce Lee genuinely didn't care about that particular restriction, though. According to Matthew Polly's biography of Bruce Lee, Lee and his production crew reportedly bribed local Roman officials in order to gain access inside. They filmed the entire sequence at night, using a genuinely minimal crew and minimal equipment. Just Bruce Lee, Chuck Norris, and a small camera team working together. The resulting fight scene runs roughly 10 total minutes of actual screen time, and is widely considered to this day as one of the single greatest martial arts fight scenes ever captured on film. Here's what genuinely makes this particular achievement so remarkable. Chuck Norris had barely acted professionally at all before this project. This essentially represented his first genuinely major film role of any kind. He had virtually no dialogue in the scene whatsoever, just the physical fight sequence itself. But the sheer authenticity of two genuine, real martial arts champions actually fighting made the entire sequence become legendary among fans. The film ultimately grossed over $130 million worldwide, beating several of Bruce Lee's own previous box office records, and became the highest-grossing film released in Hong Kong throughout all of 1972. And remarkably, the entire sequence had been filmed completely illegally inside the actual Roman Colosseum itself. In interviews given years later, Norris was frequently asked whether he and Bruce Lee had actually genuinely fought for real during filming. Norris consistently gave the exact same honest answer each time. They had trained together for years and regularly sparred with one another, but in an actual real fight, Bruce would have genuinely beaten him easily, since his overall speed was simply unbelievable to witness firsthand. But the watching world never actually saw a real fight between them on screen. They simply saw two genuine legends performing together inside the Roman Colosseum, filmed completely illegally, yet documented forever afterward in film history. That leads us into the deeply personal story of his brother's death in Vietnam back in 1970. Chuck Norris was actually refereeing a karate tournament in California at the time when an announcement suddenly came over the venue's loudspeaker system, informing him he had an urgent phone call waiting. He walked over to take the call and found his mother-in-law crying on the other end of the line. She told him his brother Wayland had just been killed in Vietnam. Norris hung up the phone, staggered backward, and simply sat down in shock. He would later say that if he had genuinely been kicked in the stomach simultaneously by a dozen different karate champions at once, it couldn't have possibly impacted him more deeply than that particular phone call did. Here are the documented facts surrounding his brother's death. Wayland Clyde Norris, serving as a private first class with Company A, 2nd Battalion of the 56th Infantry Regiment, part of the 101st Airborne Division, was killed on the 3rd of June in 1970 in Thua Thien Province, Vietnam. He was just 26 years old at the time, only 1 month away from turning 28. But here's the particular detail that has genuinely haunted Chuck Norris ever since. When Wayland was only 12 years old, he had told his older brother directly that he simply wouldn't live to see the age of 28. A genuine premonition, an intuitive feeling, something he simply somehow already knew deep down. And he ultimately turned out to be completely right about that prediction. Wayland died specifically while defending Firebase Ripcord, the site of the longest sustained battle throughout the entire Vietnam War, fought between the 12th of March and the 23rd of July in 1970. 75 American soldiers were killed during that particular battle at Ripcord. Wayland Norris was one of them. That particular battle proved so brutal and so costly overall that media outlets at the time actually imposed a complete blackout on coverage of it. The American public had genuinely grown exhausted with news coverage of Vietnam by that point. The Battle of Hamburger Hill had occurred just 1 year earlier. The military simply didn't want to risk another significant public relations disaster following that, so the entire Battle of Ripcord was essentially fought in complete media silence. Only years later did the full stories from that battle eventually emerge publicly. Bob Kalsu, who had been named Rookie of the Year for the Buffalo Bills back in 1968, was also killed during that same battle at Ripcord. Wayland Norris was posthumously awarded the Silver Star for genuine valor in combat. In 2007, Chuck Norris wrote that he still missed his brother terribly, that he thought of Wayland often, and found comfort only in the certainty that one day they would eventually be reunited with a great big hug together in heaven. Chuck never forgot his brother, and he made absolutely certain the wider world never forgot him either. That leads us into the story of dedicating Missing in Action to Wayland's memory in 1984. Cannon Films offered Chuck Norris a film deal at that time. They wanted to produce a Vietnam prisoner rescue film, specifically centered around Colonel James Braddock, a soldier who had originally escaped from a Vietnamese prison camp and years later returns to personally rescue the men who were originally left behind there. Most major studios simply didn't want to touch this particular project at all, since Vietnam-themed films weren't especially popular at the time, considered too controversial and genuinely too painful for audiences. Norris agreed to do the film regardless, specifically because he genuinely wanted to honor his brother Wieland through the project. Missing in Action was ultimately filmed in the Philippines, with Norris playing Braddock as a largely silent, deadly, essentially one-man army throughout the film, featuring minimal dialogue but maximum physical action sequences. The production actually encountered a significant budget-related issue during filming. It was originally supposed to become the first of 2 films shot back-to-back together, but Cannon Films eventually realized the second film they had shot together actually turned out considerably better than the first one, so they simply swapped the release order around entirely. The movie originally intended as the prequel became the primary Missing in Action release, while the movie originally intended as the main film instead became Missing in Action 2, The Beginning. Missing in Action opened in theaters in 1984, earning $6 million during its opening weekend alone, and ultimately earning $26 million total by 1985, becoming one of Cannon Films' biggest commercial hits. Critics widely dismissed it as a simple Rambo ripoff film. Audiences genuinely didn't care about that criticism at all. During the film's climactic ending scene, where Braddock brings rescued prisoners of war to a press conference held in Saigon, audience members reportedly stood up spontaneously inside theaters and applauded the moment. Norris later said one of the biggest, genuine thrills of his entire life came when he personally attended a theater screening of Missing in Action and watched the entire audience stand up and applaud together at the film's conclusion. 2 direct sequels followed afterward. Missing in Action 2, The Beginning, released in 1985, and Missing in Action 3, released in 1988. The entire trilogy combined earned nearly $40 million total, and Chuck personally dedicated all 3 films to Wieland's memory. At the conclusion of each individual film, a formal dedication appears on screen, honoring Wieland Norris, who gave his life in service to his country. In 2012, Norris appeared on the program War Stories alongside Oliver North specifically to discuss the siege of Firebase Ripcord in detail, speaking openly about Wieland, the battle itself, and his brother's ultimate sacrifice. He made absolutely certain his brother would always be properly remembered, and millions of people who watched Missing in Action over the years saw that heartfelt dedication appear on screen. Wieland Norris died back in 1970, but his name genuinely lived on afterward, simply because Chuck never once forgot him. That leads us into the story of Walker, Texas Ranger, running 9 full seasons across 203 total episodes. Back in 1993, CBS launched an entirely new television series called Walker, Texas Ranger. Chuck Norris played the lead character Cordell Walker, a Texas Ranger who solved crimes using martial arts, traditional old-fashioned values, and a distinctive cowboy hat. The overall concept genuinely sounds fairly ridiculous on paper. It became a genuine cultural phenomenon instead. The show ultimately ran for 9 complete seasons, spanning 203 total episodes, airing from the 21st of April in 1993 through the 19th of May in 2001. Critics genuinely hated the show throughout its run. Entertainment Weekly famously gave it only a C+ grade, calling it cheesy, over the top, and genuinely absurd. Audiences simply didn't care about any of that criticism whatsoever. Here are the actual documented viewership ratings throughout its run. During Season 1, covering 1993 through 1994, it earned an 11.7 rating, ranking 41st nationally. Season 2, covering 1994 through 1995, earned an 11.2 rating, also ranking 41st. Season 3, covering 1995 through 1996, earned a 12.3 rating, ranking 18th nationally. Season 4, covering 1996 through 1997, earned an 11.0 rating, ranking 24th. Season 5, covering 1997 through 1998, drew 14.4 million total viewers, ranking 21st nationally. Season 6, covering 1998 through 1999, also drew 14.4 million viewers, ranking 15th overall. At its absolute peak, Walker, Texas Ranger stood as one of the top 15 television shows across all of America, with 14.4 million people tuning in faithfully every single Saturday night. The show was ultimately broadcast in over 100 different countries worldwide, dubbed into dozens of separate languages, and remained in syndication on the USA Network for many years afterward. Chuck Norris personally sang the show's own theme song, titled Eyes of a Ranger, and actually won a BMI Music Television Award specifically for that particular song. The show followed a fairly simple, repeating formula throughout. Walker kicks the bad guys, teaches meaningful moral lessons, solves the crime, and then repeats that same basic pattern weekly. It genuinely shouldn't have worked as well as it ultimately did. In 1994, television critic Doug Nye wrote that Walker, Texas Ranger, represented the closest thing available at that time to an old-fashioned Western television series, explaining that Chuck Norris and the show's production team had made Saturday nights at 9 o'clock on CBS the most consistently entertaining television time slot since James Arness and Gunsmoke had occupied that exact same slot more than 20 years earlier. The show ultimately made Norris one of the single most recognizable faces anywhere in the entire world, and it also set the stage for something genuinely nobody could have possibly predicted at the time. A full decade later, Walker, Texas Ranger, would actually become a widespread comedic punchline, and would ultimately end up making Chuck Norris even more famous than the actual television show itself ever had. That leads us into the story of the Chuck Norris facts meme phenomenon. Back in 2004, on Late Night with Conan O'Brien, NBC had recently merged with Universal Studios, which suddenly gave Conan's writing team access to old archived television footage without having to pay expensive licensing fees for it. He began a recurring comedy segment called The Walker, Texas Ranger Lever. The overall concept was genuinely simple. Conan had an actual physical lever mounted next to his desk. Whenever he pulled that lever, a random clip taken from Walker, Texas Ranger would play on screen, usually featuring something fairly absurd, over-the-top action sequences, cheesy scripted dialogue, or exaggerated martial arts nonsense. The studio audience genuinely loved laughing at these clips. Chuck Norris essentially became something of a running comedic punchline through this segment. But something else entirely happened alongside that development as well. Back in 2005, on the Something Awful internet forums, a discussion thread started up called Post Your Vin Diesel Facts, featuring various satirical claims about actor Vin Diesel's supposed toughness, jokes like Vin Diesel being able to divide by zero, or that his tears could supposedly cure cancer, though sadly he had apparently never actually cried before. This particular joke format quickly went genuinely viral online. Then, someone eventually suggested doing the exact same joke format, but specifically about Chuck Norris instead. A college student going by the username Ryan Nickham eventually created an entire dedicated website called chucknorrisfacts.com. Every single time you refresh that particular webpage, an entirely new joke fact about Chuck Norris would appear on screen. Jokes like, Chuck Norris doesn't actually do push-ups, he simply pushes the entire Earth downward instead. Or that Chuck Norris had counted all the way to infinity twice already. The underlying joke essentially explained that whenever Chuck Norris performs a push-up, he genuinely isn't lifting his own body upward at all, he's actually pushing the entire planet downward beneath him instead. That particular website reportedly received over 10 million total visits within just its first month online. By 2006, Chuck Norris-themed jokes had spread absolutely everywhere online, across Facebook, MySpace, forwarded chain emails, printed t-shirts, bumper stickers, and even into mainstream politics. Presidential candidate Mike Huckabee actually ran official campaign advertisements featuring Chuck Norris jokes during his 2008 presidential run. The overall phenomenon eventually became genuinely global, translated into dozens of different languages worldwide. Similar Chuck Norris-style jokes eventually appeared in India centered around local celebrities, and in Poland centered around different regional public figures. This particular comedic format simply spread virtually everywhere around the world. And here's the genuinely documented part of this entire story. Chuck Norris didn't get angry about any of this at all. He actually genuinely embraced the entire phenomenon instead. In 2009, he actually published his own official Chuck Norris Facts book, which made the bestseller list, and he appeared on various talk shows personally reading his own favorite jokes aloud, even using the meme's massive popularity to help promote various charitable causes he supported. On his personal website, WorldNet Daily, Norris himself wrote that some of the jokes were genuinely funny, some were admittedly pretty far-fetched, but that thankfully, most of them were simply promoting harmless entertainment and fun overall. He genuinely understood something that most other celebrities simply don't grasp. This particular meme phenomenon made him genuinely relevant to an entirely new generation of young people who had never actually watched Walker, Texas Ranger at all. Kids born throughout the 1990s, who had genuinely no idea who Chuck Norris even was, suddenly knew practically everything about him instead. This particular meme phenomenon introduced him to millions of entirely new fans. And even today, if you search Chuck Norris online, the very first results that appear generally aren't his films or his martial arts championship titles at all. They're the jokes and memes instead. A 65-year-old martial artist became a genuine cultural phenomenon simply because the internet turned him into a running joke, and he happened to be smart enough to laugh right along with everyone else. That leads us into the story of his difficult childhood, marked by genuine poverty and an alcoholic father. On the 10th of March in 1940, in Ryan, Oklahoma, Carlos Ray Norris was born, named directly after his father's own minister at the time, and was the eldest of 3 brothers total. His father, Ray Norris, worked various jobs over the years as a truck driver, mechanic, and bus driver, essentially taking whatever work he could actually find available. He was also, unfortunately, a genuine alcoholic. Ray Norris regularly went on extended drinking binges lasting for months at a time, spending his entire paycheck exclusively on alcohol, and consistently leaving his family with absolutely nothing left over financially. Chuck's mother, Wilma, was ultimately forced to raise all 3 boys essentially alone, with no reliable money, no genuine stability, and very little outside support available to her. By the time Chuck turned 15 years old, the family had already moved a total of 16 separate times, facing evictions, unpaid rent, constantly running from mounting debts, and living inside trailers and various low-rent housing situations across Oklahoma, California, and Arizona, essentially wherever they could actually afford to live at any given moment. Chuck later described himself during this period as genuinely shy, non-athletic, and academically fairly mediocre overall. He felt genuinely embarrassed by his father's ongoing behavior, embarrassed by the family's obvious poverty, and even embarrassed simply speaking in front of his own classmates at school. He developed what he later personally described as a genuinely debilitating form of introversion during this period of his life. When Chuck was 12 years old, the family relocated to Torrance, California, with his mother genuinely hoping for a fresh start there. Ray Norris continued drinking heavily regardless. When Chuck eventually turned 16, his parents finally divorced. His father walked out of the family entirely and left permanently. Chuck subsequently took over as the effective head of the household. As the eldest brother present, he essentially became the man of the house, helping his mother raise both Wieland and Aaron, working various odd jobs, and doing whatever was genuinely necessary to help support the family financially. He graduated from North Torrance High School in 1958, though only barely managing to do so. He then joined the United States Air Force afterward. At that point, he genuinely had no real plan, no particular skills, and very little self-confidence. But he did have one crucial thing going for him. He absolutely refused to ever quit trying. While serving in the Air Force, stationed at Osan Air Base in South Korea, Chuck Norris first discovered Tang Soo Do, a traditional Korean martial art. For the very first time in his entire life, he genuinely found something he was actually good at doing. He trained obsessively at it, eventually earned his black belt, and returned home to the United States, continuing his training afterward at March Air Force Base in California. When he was finally discharged from military service in 1962, he opened his own small karate school while simultaneously applying to become a police officer in Torrance. He taught classes regularly, barely earned any real money from it initially, and lost his first 10 competitive fights along the way, but he genuinely never quit trying regardless. The once shy kid with an alcoholic father, who had moved 16 separate times throughout his difficult childhood, ultimately became a genuine world champion. And years later, once Chuck Norris finally became famous, his own mother was still there personally to witness it happen. Wilma Norris ultimately lived to be 102 years old, passing away in 2024. Chuck personally credited her for absolutely everything he ever accomplished. She had endured the deaths of 2 separate husbands, a stepson, 2 grandchildren, and her younger son Wieland during the Vietnam War. And she had always prayed faithfully for her son throughout everything, asking God directly to protect and save her boy. The boy she had prayed so faithfully for eventually became a genuine legend. That leads us into the story of holding the world champion title for 6 consecutive years straight. On the 24th of November in 1968, Chuck Norris defeated Louis Delgado, officially becoming the professional middleweight karate champion, and successfully held that particular title for 6 consecutive years afterward, remaining completely undefeated throughout 1968, 1969, 1970, 1971, 1972, and 1973. 6 full years with absolutely no losses recorded. Nobody could genuinely beat him during that entire stretch. Here are the fully documented facts surrounding this remarkable achievement. Chuck Norris won virtually every major karate championship held between 1965 and 1974, including the National Karate Championships in 1966, the All-Star Championships in 1966, the World Middleweight Karate Championship in 1967, the All-American Karate Championship across both 1967 and 1968, the Internationals in 1968, the National Tournament of Champions in 1968, the American Tang Soo Do Championship, and the North American Karate Championship as well. His overall career fight record ultimately stood at 183 wins, 10 losses, and 2 draws total. All 10 of those particular losses had occurred before 1968. After that specific year, he remained genuinely undefeated for the rest of his competitive career, personally defeating every major champion of that entire era, including Joe Louis, Skipper Mullins, Arnold Urquidez, Victor Moore, and Steve Sanders. Black Belt Magazine officially named him Fighter of the Year back in 1969. He also became the very first person ever voted into the Black Belt Hall of Fame, and remarkably, he was actually inducted 3 separate times total as Player of the Year in 1968, as Instructor of the Year in 1975, and as Man of the Year in 1977. In 1974, Chuck Norris officially retired from competitive fighting entirely. Not because he had lost a fight, and not because he had suffered any serious injury either, but simply because there was genuinely nobody left remaining for him to fight at that point. At just 34 years old, he walked away from competition entirely as the fully undefeated world champion. By that point, he had personally trained over 325 separate students to the rank of black belt, opened 32 different martial arts schools scattered across America, founded the United Fighting Arts Federation organization, and even created his own original martial arts style, which he called Chun Kuk Do. But here's what genuinely makes this entire story so remarkable overall. Chuck Norris genuinely wasn't a natural-born athlete at all. He was shy, physically weak, uncoordinated, and lost his first 10 competitive fights outright. He ultimately became a world champion purely through sheer determination, consistent training, strict discipline, and simply refusing to ever quit trying. In interviews given over the years, Norris consistently said essentially the exact same thing each time. Whatever luck he ultimately had, he genuinely made entirely for himself. He explained he was never a naturally gifted athlete, but he paid his dues thoroughly through sweat, focused concentration, and took whatever time was genuinely necessary to properly learn karate and eventually become a true world champion. From 1968 all the way through 1974, absolutely nobody could ever beat Chuck Norris. And when he finally retired from competition, he did so entirely on his own personal terms, undefeated, and remaining world champion for 6 consecutive years straight.